Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because I know we have people from LA to Israel with us. Welcome to our Monday call with ELNET. My name is Marta Kubica, and I'm the executive director of ELNET Poland, and I'm very happy that we can host today a great journalist and great friend of ours as well, Mr. Konstanty Gebert, who will talk about the current development that it seems that they're causing another crisis in Polish-Israeli diplomatic relations. I don't want to spoil too much, so let me just go to organization, a little logistics. Please mute yourself and please remain muted. There will be a chance to ask a question to our speaker. It will be after let's say 20 minutes. You can write your questions in chat, and then I will be more than happy to give floor to you so we can ask your questions directly. I also wanted to welcome many friends that I can see on the guest list. I'm very happy you're with us today. And let me introduce our guest, even though I'm sure many of you know him very well. Konstanty Gebert is an international reporter and a columnist with the leading Polish daily Gazeta Wyborcza. He's also a democratic opposition activist in the 70s and underground journalist in the 80s. Mr. Gebert co-founded the underground Jewish Flying University and the Polish Jewish intellectual monthly Midrash, among others. Mr. Gebert has taught at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, UC Berkeley, and Grinnell College. He has also authored 11 books, including Israeli history and commentaries on the Torah. In 2018, he was recognized with the American Jewish Press Association Rockover Award. Mr. Gebert, the Polish Parliament last month passed an amendment to the country's Code of Administrative Procedure, which makes it impossible to legally challenge the administrative decisions if 30 years or more have passed since they were passed. Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid tweeted immediately that and called the act a disgrace that will not erase the horrors of the memory of the Holocaust, and an immoral law which will seriously harm relations between the two countries. On the other side, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki responded by saying that as long as he remains the Prime Minister of Poland, Poland will not pay for German crimes. Not one zloty, not €1, not $1. I really hope that after today's conversation, many of our listeners will understand how sensitive and complicated this issue is, and how hard it is to take a fair stand on this matter, and also how does it affect bilateral relations between Israel and Poland. So Mr. Gebert, I would like to ask you, what's your take on Yair Lapid's reaction and further comments on the Polish sides and this ping pong of tweets and comments, and how do you feel also about dragging the memory of Holocaust survivors and Holocaust victims into another political battle, because I believe we can call it that way?
It's another battle in an ongoing political war. And the problem is that, as opposed to what obtained 2.5 years ago, when Poland passed the so-called Holocaust law, which essentially censored important aspects of Holocaust speech, this time there's no problem with the law. There's every problem with the Polish government acting in ill faith and the Israeli government acting in more or less uninformed hysteria. And the two feed on each other and have created a perfect storm which risks to deeply derail mutual relations. Let me explain. The amendment that the Polish parliament passed and which has just cleared Senate, now it will return to the parliament and then to the president for signature, is a necessary element of any country's legislation. It says that any administrative decision becomes irremovable after 30 years, even if it was made in flagrant violation of the law. In other words, if I get to benefit from a decision made by the Polish administrative authorities, even if they broke the law making that decision, after 30 years, the decision is final and cannot be changed. And most legal systems have clauses of this kind to ensure a basic trust in the decisions of government and the law. The problem is not with the fact that this amendment was passed. Actually, it was late in passing because the Polish Constitutional Tribunal already in 2015 had passed a verdict saying that the government needs to include this amendment in order to ensure trust in decisions of government. And that was the time when the Constitutional Tribunal was still a free and independent body and not taken over by the ruling party, as is now the case. However, one of the consequences of this amendment will be that it makes very difficult for people who lost property under the Nazis or under the communists to try to get their property back, as many decisions regarding that property have been made on the basis of administrative procedure and now cannot be challenged. Now, this clearly was one of the goals of the government. The government intended to make property restitution much more difficult. However, the law per se is not to blame. What is to be challenged is the government's obstinate refusal to pass a restitution law. Poland is the only country in Europe within the EU that was occupied by the Germans and then failed to pass a restitution law. This amendment increases dramatically the difficulty of obtaining restitution, and that the possibility of obtaining restitution was already dim under the legislation before it got changed. So we should not be attacking the Polish government for passing this law. We should be attacking it for not passing a restitution law. Incidentally, and obviously, the lack of restitution law is just as unfair to Jewish victims of Nazi and communist depredations as it is to non-Jewish victims. This is not necessarily a Polish-Jewish issue. It's an issue of basic fairness. However, the Israeli government reacted hysterically. Essentially, Yair Lapid took care of that by saying that the law is an insult to the memory of survivors of the Shoah. And today, in an article published in Haaretz, he returns with another charge that it is borders on Holocaust denial. For the life of me, I cannot see any justification for this kind of accusations. What they do is they strengthen what the Polish government is trying to do, that is present itself as the victim of unfair and baseless attacks from the Israeli side. And Yair Lapid comes with luggage from the debate around the Holocaust speech law 2.5 years ago, when he first supported the term Polish concentration camps and then falsely claimed that his grandmother was a victim of Poles, not Germans, in occupied Poland. He had to withdraw the second one. He still sticks to his guns on the first one. Now, the fact that the Israeli reaction is baseless, plays beautifully in the hands of the Polish government, that then goes on to make its fundamental claim that that Jews in general, or Israel in particular, are trying to obtain compensation from Poland for wartime losses. Now, if anybody was demanding compensation from Poland for wartime losses, that obviously would be outrageous. Compensation was demanded and then partially received from the perpetrators of those losses, that is, Germany and its legal successor. However, what Jewish organizations and the state of Israel are demanding legitimately is restitution of property. And the Polish government is lying through its teeth by pretending it does not know that or does not see the difference. And each unsubstantiated attack on the Polish government's policy strengthens the verisimilitude that they might be right in saying that we're being asked to compensate wartime losses, and not, as the fact is, they're being asked to restitute property seized during wartime. Now, why, and then with this I'll conclude, why is it that all this is happening right now? Poland is in a political crisis on a slow burner without the repetitive early elections that Israel had had, but the government coalition is on the verge of losing its majority. Its original majority was paper thin, 6 MPs, and at any given moment, the government might or might not have a majority, and early elections are clearly a possibility. If the ruling coalition, that is the Law and Justice Party and its two junior partners, two small right-wing parties, have any chance of staying in power after an early election, they will need to convince the extreme right electorate to vote for them and not for the more extreme right parties that are present on the political scene. And nothing works better to convince the extreme right voters to support the government as showing that the government is standing up to the Jews. And this is exactly what the government is doing. Tolerating, if not encouraging, anti-Semitic speech and action. We saw that a week ago at the 80th anniversary of the massacre in Jedwabne, which happened to fall on a Shabbat, so the Jewish ceremonies were removed till Sunday. And on Saturday, we were treated to a demonstration at the site of the massacre by Polish nationalists, one of them literally dancing on the graves of the victims while playing around with two large Polish flags. Their demand was that Jews apologize for their crimes against the Poles. Next day, a Jewish delegation that came there to pray was stopped by the police and only allowed to proceed after the police have taken down everybody's identities. I mean, these are new developments, and they strengthen the government's message that we're standing up to the Jews, vote for us. We shouldn't be playing in their hands.
And how, in your opinion, how does the Polish Jewish community actually react? What was the reaction of the Polish Jewish community to the amendment a month ago and recently to what happened in the Senate?
We did not have an official statement by the Polish Jewish community. What we did have was the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudryk, being invited to hearings in the Senate, in which he said that the case is very simple. We have a commandment, do not steal. Therefore, do not steal. And this generated a hate campaign against the rabbi of an intensity that, to my eyes, is deeper and more worrying than the general anti-Semitic campaign we witnessed 2.5 years ago after the passing of the Holocaust speech law.
Right. And how do you think, well, we were talking about Yair Lapid, and who sees this bill as anti-Semitic gesture, dignifying, defaming the dignity and memory of the Holocaust victims. And, you know, from Polish perspective, it's very hard to justify such an accusation. It seems very emotional and not really rooted anywhere near the reality. Why do you think Lapid's reaction was so strong? Is it also internal Israeli politics that Poland is falling as one of the victims of?
Well, nobody ever lost an election in Israel by not being tough enough on the polls. That's another thing we have in common. But my fear is that Yair Lapid has a complicated relationship with truth. He wouldn't be the only high government functionary to have that. We have a prime minister who accuses Jews of demanding compensation from Poland, fully knowing that this is not the case, or says that any Jew who survived World War II survived in Poland, survived thanks to the help of Poles, whereas the overwhelming majority survived thanks to the help of Soviets. And meeting Poles would not necessarily mean help, it would also mean denunciation and murder. So we have two postmodern politicians with rather elastic attitudes towards factual truth. And this certainly does not help the case. And the case is simple, as I said. There's nothing wrong with the law. There's everything wrong with the fact that Poland has not passed a restitution law. And this amendment makes the non-passing of the restitution law even more scandalous. We should be demanding the passing of restitution law and not complaining about this particular amendment.
Thank you. Well, Poland and Israel has a long history of trying to solve the restitution problem. There were some moments in our history, in our bilateral history, that we were pretty close, and then everything was falling down again. Could you maybe say something on that? Because it's actually also a very interesting topic that for several times we were very close to solving the restitution issue, and both sides were very close to agreeing on certain solutions. What happened?
Well, first of all, let me stress that, again, Poland is the only EU member country that was occupied by the Germans in World War II and failed to pass a restitution law. And this is simply unacceptable and inexcusable. Having said that, yes, Poland is facing more challenges than other formerly German-occupied countries in that respect. First of all, the sheer scale of the destruction in World War II creates potentially a larger number of restitution demands than in other places in which the Jewish community was not as large nor so heavily destroyed. And it is obvious that in many cases, the physical restitution of the property will not be feasible and financial compensation will be paid out instead. And the Polish parliaments legitimately were concerned about how big that compensation will be. Second, it's not primarily about anti-Semitism. According to a Polish Foreign Ministry estimate from 10 years ago, about 20% of the applications for property restitution would come from the heirs of Polish Jews, the remaining 80% coming from non-Jewish Poles. Thirdly, the elephant in the room that is unmentionable is the fact that 1/3 of Poland was Germany until 1945. And it's unthinkable that Poland would pass a law discriminating the citizens of another EU member country, being Germany. So any restitution law that would be passed would also enable German claims, which of course increases the size of the potential financial cost to completely stratospheric levels. Now, the German government has already said it will not assist its citizens in making such applications if a law is passed, but they cannot forbid them to do that. So bottom line is, while there is a number of reasons why the problem is intrinsically complicated, there is no constituency for pressing forward. The Polish parliaments, as you mentioned, that tried to address this issue, usually approached it in a very gung-ho feeling in the early months after the election, saying, okay, this is a huge problem, we need to solve it. And then as the next election date started looming larger and larger, they realized that there's almost nobody amongst their voters who supports property restitution, and very important segments of the population are dead set against. Basically, why should my tax money go to compensate people who lost property? I lost half of my family and nobody's compensating me for that. There is absolutely no reward in supporting restitution. Anti-Semitism helps, but anti-Semitism is not the driving mechanism here.
Thank you. I just wanted to go to one more issue before we open the floor to the questions. One of the arguments that both Polish government right now is using, and also the former Polish government was using, was an agreement signed in the 1960 between the US and the Polish People's Republic that states that all the claims that US citizens might have will be satisfied by the US if Polish People's Republic will pay $40 million to the US government. Can you comment on that? Because it's one of the arguments being used by a lot of politicians nowadays, that Poland signed it with the US, so Poland is not going to pay to any US citizens any dollar because we solved that problem in the 1960s. But it's not really like that.
Well, this is the problem. This is a classical example of a bona fide statement being used in ill faith to justify a falsehood. It is true that the Polish-US agreement of 1960 covered the claims of people who were US citizens or had become US citizens at the date of signing. It does not cover the claims of people who became US citizens after 1960. The Americans tried to explain it to the Polish government most recently when Mike Pompeo was in Warsaw for the anti-Iran Middle East conference that Warsaw was hosting, and essentially was told to go fly a kite. Nobody was even interested in opening the discussion. The Polish government's position is the Americans are lying through their teeth and they know it. It so happens that the Polish government is lying through its teeth and knows it. But the Americans at that time thought it expedient not to press the matter further. And it needs to be said that sadly, the leading proponent of this theory that the 1960 agreement covers all claims of US citizens till Messiah comes is Radek Sikorski, who was foreign minister under the previous liberal government. And he is giving very vocal propaganda support to the position, the illegitimate position of the current government on the issue. Sadly, the Polish opposition has completely flunked the test. Whereas in 2018, during the passing of the Holocaust law, at least one opposition MP voted against, the rest abstained, allowing the law to pass. Not one opposition vote went against the passing of this amendment in Parliament. Not one opposition MP mentioned that this puts the heirs of property seized by the Nazis at a huge unfair disadvantage. The opposition knows that if it were to speak out, it will be immediately branded as agents of Jewish influence, and therefore deny itself any chance of winning any future election. This is the sad reality.
Thank you. So I will try to have some chutzpah here and ask you, how do you think, or what both sides should do, except of passing the restitution law, because that doesn't sound very possible in the near future, to restart the elections? Because right now we're facing a very strange situation where there is no really an official dialogue again after 2018. There is a will, but I don't really see any actions on both sides.
I'm not optimistic. The Polish government will not back down because it stands to benefit a great deal from its principled anti-Jewish stand, and early elections might happen at any moment. The opposition will not force the Polish government to take action because it cannot afford to be branded as sympathetic to the Jewish cause. Polish public opinion is becoming more anti-Semitic. Before we started, we were chit-chatting, and I said, well, there's good news today. A public opinion poll in Hungary revealed that 1/3 of the Hungarians is anti-Semitic. So there's somebody who is more anti-Semitic than us. That's good news. However, I'm not sure what the results would be if a similar poll would be made in Poland today. In Israel, there is a stunning lack of appreciation of just how off-target Israeli policy has been on this law and how badly it has been received by all of Polish public opinion. I'm sorry about the street noise. I live next to the fire brigade, and there has been some rain, and therefore the fire brigade is out to try to help victims of the rain. Anyway, Israel would have to change its assessment of the law. This law helps defraud the heirs of those murdered in the Shoah, but by itself, it is neither anti-Semitic, nor is it disrespectful towards the memory of the survivors, nor is it borderline Holocaust denial. On top of that, Yair Lapid has famously tweeted that we don't want Polish money. Well, if you don't want Polish money, what's the whole story about, right? I thought we're trying to get compensation for property lost. If the government of Warsaw would be brighter, they would actually applaud Lapid for making such a positive and constructive move and say, okay, so the issue of money is off the table, and now we can return to discussing cultural exchange and tourism. Everything has been settled. I don't see a way out, not with this government. I don't see necessarily a way out with the new Israeli government. And I'm not terribly optimistic about the new Polish government either. I'm afraid you didn't get me on my optimist day.
Thank you. Well, I hope we will get you on your optimist day one day, or at least that our relations will go back to where they were, at least closer to 2017, which I recall it was, I would say, the peak of modern Polish-Israeli relations. And